What would you do if your husband casually walked away from a public playground where your nephew had just peed himself without telling anyone? Just because, in his words, that's not my responsibility. A small act, but one that exposes a deep value gap between husband and wife, between a sense of responsibility to the community and a belief in individual freedom of choice. At first glance, it's just a puddle of urine, but it quickly spirals into a heated argument, pushing the couple to the brink of a serious fracture. So, who's really in the wrong here? And more importantly, is love truly enough to bridge such fundamental differences? Let's unpack this story together. What would you do if your husband casually walked away from a public playground where your nephew had just peed himself without telling anyone, simply because that's not his responsibility? A small act, yet it reveals a massive value gap between husband and wife, between being accountable to a community and defending personal freedom of choice. At first glance, it seems like just a puddle of pee, but it exploded into a heated argument, pushing both of them to the brink of emotional collapse. So, who's really being unreasonable? And more importantly, is love ever enough to bridge such fundamental differences? But to truly understand that uncontainable anger, we need to step back. Because the fight at Chick-fil-A that day didn't start with a puddle. It started with something deeper, cracks that had, long been forming beneath the surface, the relationship between the wife and her in-laws. The wife in this story, a 28-year-old woman, is no stranger to feeling judged, belittled, or pushed aside when it comes to her husband's family. Her relationship with her in-laws has hit rock bottom more than once. Both sides have openly admitted they don't like each other. No pretense, no fake smiles, just raw mutual dislike. And yet she still chose to uphold respect. She actively set boundaries to avoid conflict, not because she's controlling or manipulative, but because she wanted peace. She never tried to change them, only asked for limits to keep things from spiraling. But even those boundaries were seen as offensive. They didn't like that. And in an environment where you know you're disliked, disrespected, how comfortable can you really feel letting those same people take care of your child? Still, she didn't object. On the contrary, both she and her husband Larry agreed. The kids deserve a relationship with their grandparents, regardless of the adults' issues. That's not an easy decision. Any parent would tell you. Letting your child be close to people you don't fully trust is both brave and painful. She chose to stay out of that family gathering. She stepped aside intentionally, giving the grandparents space to bond with their grandkids without tension getting in the way. It was a conscious withdrawal to let peace have a fighting chance, at least for the children. But in that withdrawal, she placed complete trust in her husband. She trusted that he would be the middle ground, the one who ensured everything went smoothly. More importantly, she believed he'd speak up if something went wrong. And then, it happened. A child, Larry's nephew, had an accident and peed on the playground at Chick-fil-A. Nobody's fault, just a kid being a kid. But what shocked her wasn't the accident. It was how Larry and his parents handled it. They chose to walk away in silence. Not a single word to the staff. No warning to the restaurant that an area might now be unsanitary, that other children could be affected. And when she asked about it, so Larry responded coldly, "He's not my kid. I'm just respecting my parents' decision." That sentence cut through every ounce of patience she'd ever held on to. It wasn't just about indifference toward the staff or future kids playing there. It was a quiet confession. I won't speak up if it upsets my mom. And for a woman who had swallowed years of bitterness in the name of family, that was the final line. The one she could no longer cross. To Larry, it might have been a small thing, a gesture of personal choice, but to her, it was a test of trust, one that failed spectacularly. We often think big arguments come from big events, but the deepest wounds, they come from the smallest moments, an action, a phrase, at exactly the wrong time. The story began simply, or at least it seemed simple. A casual meetup at Chick-fil-A, where the grandparents wanted to see their grandson before leaving town. Just a normal afternoon, kids laughing, the smell of fast food in the air, the buzz of conversation. She didn't go, not because she was busy, but because she wanted to give space to her husband's family. So the visit wouldn't be clouded by the complicated feelings that sometimes swirl between adults. A decision made out of grace, a quiet step back, done in good faith. But when her husband, Larry, came home, what he shared shattered her calm like glass breaking on tile. He told it almost carelessly, like it was just a random detail. Oh, yeah, something crazy happened. My nephew peed himself on the playground, and my parents didn't tell anyone. She froze. She asked, "Did anyone step in it? Did someone clean it up?" Larry replied, "I don't know. When we left, the place was empty, the restaurant was closing. My parents didn't think it was necessary to say anything." She asked again, "Well, did you tell anyone?" The answer, short, simple, and as heavy as a hammer crashing into her trust, was, "No, I didn't think it was my responsibility. He's not my kid." In that moment, she heard it, a crack, the sound of something solid breaking inside her. Now imagine this. You're a mother, a wife, someone who's endured countless uncomfortable moments with your in-laws for the sake of peace. You've stepped back, stayed quiet so others could feel comfortable. You let your husband play the peacemaker, but what you get in return is cowardly silence, justified by two words, "Not mine." She didn't blame the child. It's something that can happen to any kid. She wasn't even completely surprised the in-laws left without telling anyone. They'd always put their own convenience above the rest of the world. But Larry was supposed to be different. Larry, the man she loved, the one who talked with her about values, kindness, about love that transcends prejudice. The one who once believed even the smallest actions should be taken with a sense of responsibility toward the community. Yet now, he chose silence. He chose to walk away. He chose to look the other way, just to avoid upsetting his parents. Or worse, because deep down he truly didn't care. When Larry said, "I was just respecting my parents' decision," she realized something. In his mind, respecting his parents ranked higher than respecting basic decency, higher than protecting other children who might play in that space, higher than the responsibility of being an adult. Not even as a parent, just as someone present, someone aware, someone who could have stopped something bad from happening to someone else. To him, the silence might have meant keeping the peace. But to her, it was complicity. It was a total failure, not just as a husband or a father, but as a human who's supposed to know right from wrong. She began to feel angry, not because of a puddle of pee, but because the man she trusted, the man she believed in, didn't have the courage to stand up for even the smallest act of decency. When her anger finally burst into words, there was no softness, no filter. She called him a selfish wimp. Two words built from layers of disappointment, silence, and self-restraint. Maybe in that moment she went too far. But was she truly wrong? A child's accident could have been easily fixed with just a word to the staff. But the collapse of one's moral compass, when someone chooses to do nothing in the name of respecting others' decisions, that's far harder to clean up. Silence doesn't mean innocence. Sometimes staying silent in the face of wrongdoing is the most dangerous thing of all. And that silence pushed a marriage already strained by compromise one step closer to confrontation. A seemingly harmless puddle of urine, had it been cleaned up, had it been acknowledged, became the final drop that made the glass overflow. And from a long simmering frustration as she listened to Larry recount the story, the wife in this tale could no longer stay silent. She got angry. Not the kind of impulsive, irrational anger, but a deep, smoldering fury that had been bottled up over time, from the many moments of being dismissed by her in laws, to the times she had swallowed her pride to keep the peace, to her belief that her husband would balance everything out. But this time, he didn't. He stayed silent and stood on his parents' side. What she said cut like a knife, cold and painful. You're selfish and you're weak. You care more about your mom's fragile ego than the safety of other children. Larry was stunned. To him, it was a blow out of nowhere. Not because he didn't recognize that something was wrong. He knew his parents hadn't acted appropriately. In fact, that's why he had shared the story with his wife in the first place. He was bothered, but he hadn't thought that staying silent would be seen as full complicity. To him, it was simply a choice not to escalate things, not to cause a scene, not to embarrass his parents. At that moment, the argument was no longer about a child wetting their pants or whether they should have informed the staff. It had transformed into a courtroom where both sides stood armed with opposing value systems. No one has the right to stay silent if it affects others. That's not a personal choice. That's irresponsibility. Stoję you, Larry. You can't force people to behave the way you think they should. Not everyone sees things your way. My parents didn't think it was necessary, and I respected that. What about the truth? What about the staff? What about the other kids who might step in it? Who's responsible for that? You stayed silent. That means you took a side. Larry, I didn't take a side. You always act like if I'm not with you, I must be against you. Hermantar inasat shantinashun. No, I just want you to stand on the side of what's right, but you chose convenience because you're scared of hurting your mom's feelings. Their words cut across each other like blades, and the more they argued, the clearer it became that the gap between them wasn't about one specific situation. It was a systemic difference. Larry was someone who valued individual freedom. For as long as he could remember, he believed everyone had the right to choose how to live, how to respond, as long as they didn't directly harm others. To him, his parents had simply chosen not to report it, and since no one else was around, they didn't believe it was wrong. But for her, both by instinct and lived experience, every action has consequences, and social responsibility is non-negotiable. To her, silence in the face of wrongdoing is a form of complicity, especially when the person staying silent is an adult who knows better. She felt betrayed, not just because he didn't speak up, but because he didn't understand the pain of trusting someone, only to have them turn their back, even if unintentionally. Larry, on the other hand, felt trapped, like there was no right move he could make. Everything he said, every choice he made, seemed to be judged through the lens of, "You're not good enough." He felt like he was constantly trying to balance between his parents and his wife, and always failing. The fight exploded. Harsh words, wounded looks, and then silence. Not because the anger was gone, but because each of them had retreated into their own world, trying to figure out, why can't the other person understand me? But the strange thing is, even in the heat of that anger, they still loved each other. It was clear in how they told the story, in how Larry still shared the incident with his wife, knowing it would upset her, in how she still tried to maintain a connection between their child and the grandparents, even when she herself didn't feel welcomed. And even in how, after everything, she began to realize she may have gone too far, and started wondering if she had placed too much weight on her husband's shoulders. Maybe they haven't found the answer yet. But what's certain is this. The argument wasn't just a moment of losing control. It was a mirror, reflecting the values they'd each been quietly carrying long before they ever met. And now, under one roof, those values are brushing up against each other, demanding to be confronted, no longer able to be ignored. The argument that night didn't end with a reconciliation. There was no tearful hug, no heartfelt apology, just silence. A kind of silence that wasn't peaceful or restful. It was heavy, uncomfortable, the kind that thickens the air in a room, making even a stranger walking in feel the weight of everything left unsaid. Larry went to bed early. His wife cleared the dishes like a machine, eyes staring off into nothing. Neither of them said a word. Neither had the energy to keep arguing, but they both knew it wasn't over. It was just paused, waiting for someone to be brave enough to speak first. What kept the tension alive in the days that followed wasn't the size of the issue, it was the unresolved emotions. And emotions, when not spoken out loud, often turn into quiet assumptions. She thought, he doesn't respect my moral boundaries. He thought, she always thinks she's right, and that I'm automatically wrong. She added, if he thinks that incident didn't matter, then maybe he also doesn't value what I believe in. And he continued, if something that small made her doubt who I am, then maybe she never really knew me at all. We often think that loving each other deeply makes forgiveness easier, but sometimes the more we love, the more vulnerable we become, because we place higher expectations on each other. And when those expectations are betrayed, even just a little, the pain can cut deeper than any blade. Days passed. They barely saw each other due to mismatched work schedules. She worked days, Larry worked nights. Strangely, the distance gave them each time to reflect, not to assign blame, but to ask, am I seeing this through too harsh a lens? Am I reacting to old wounds, not the present situation? She began to feel remorse. Not because she thought she was completely wrong, but because she realized that no matter how angry she was, calling the person she loved a selfish coward was a blow that crushed his self-worth. And that was never what she wanted to do. She remembered the look in Larry's eyes. Not just confusion, but real hurt. She knew her husband wasn't irresponsible or dismissive. He was the same man who once stood up in intense public debates, who defended the homeless when his friends mocked them. He wasn't heartless. Maybe he just chose to keep peace with family because he feared losing the fragile connection he still had with his parents. She sighed. A part of her wanted to forgive. Another part still felt shaken. And that's the hardest part. Forgiveness doesn't mean the pain disappears. Forgiveness is a decision to keep holding on to the relationship even when it would be easier to let go. As for Larry, he began to reflect too. Beneath his anger at being criticized, he felt ashamed, because deep down he knew she was right. He hadn't spoken up when he should have. He'd stayed silent to avoid conflict, to respect others' choices. But looking back, he realized that in that moment, that kind of respect was actually a cowardly excuse. Eventually, when the two of them finally found time to sit down and talk, not shouting, no tears, they began discussing values. They weren't trying to win anymore. Instead, they asked each other, why did that moment feel so important to you? Why did you feel it wasn't necessary to say something right then? Is there a middle ground when one person wants to keep the peace and the other wants to do what's right? The conversation lasted a long time, not to solve everything at once, but to reopen the door to understanding each other again. And then she said something, a temporary conclusion, maybe. I used to think if you didn't stand with me, then you were standing against me. But now I realize sometimes you were just trying to stay in the middle. And maybe I pushed you to pick sides when I should have let you explain. And for the first time, Larry admitted, I was wrong not to speak up. Not because of whose kid it was, but because it happened in a public space. I stayed silent, and you had every right to be upset. In the end, there was no winner, but they both began to understand. In a long-term relationship, the most important thing isn't being the one who's right. It's being the one who's brave enough to make it right. And that's when she suggested, what if we try marriage counseling? Not because we're weak, but because we're finally strong enough to learn how to understand each other again. That conversation, seemingly a reconciliation, was actually a mutual reckoning. It wasn't one side blaming and the other defending. For the first time, both laid their bare truths on the table. This is my fear. This is my wound. She was no longer yelling. He was no longer defensive. They looked at each other as if to say, we've lost our way, but we're still here, not giving up. That was the first sign of healing. When Larry admitted he had stayed silent because he didn't want to disrupt his fragile relationship with his parents, she understood. Not because it was right, but because the fear of being rejected by your parents is something too many people have carried. And when she said, I just wanted you to be brave because I've been treated like a nuisance for standing up for what's right my whole life, Larry began to realize. She wasn't angry just because of a public bathroom incident. She was angry because loneliness had been a shape inside her for far too long. Marriage, sometimes, is like two people diving into deep waters, each with their own oxygen tank. If they're not careful, they'll drag each other down. But if they learn how to share oxygen at the right moments, they can rise and breathe again together. And in this story, the moment they mentioned going to marriage counseling wasn't a sign that their relationship was on the verge of collapse. It was proof that they valued it enough not to throw it away over one detour. She no longer demanded that Larry stand up to his parents. Larry no longer tried to convince her that people have the right to act how they want. Instead, they asked each other, next time something like this happens, how can we handle it so neither of us feels let down? If I feel you're not protecting me, how can I say it without making you feel attacked? If I think you're overreacting, can I share that without making you feel criticized? These questions weren't easy, but they opened a new door in their communication, a place where neither had to be on guard, where both could show up as people with wounds, but also with a desire to heal together. And most importantly, she didn't take back her frustration. She transformed it. She didn't say, I'm sorry I got mad. She said, I'm sorry I made you feel unworthy when all I wanted was for you to understand how much that hurt me. Larry didn't try to explain anymore. He said, I think I've gotten so used to avoiding conflict that I forgot. Sometimes we need to speak up, not to go against someone, but to protect what's still good in this world. In that moment, they were no longer two people in an argument, but two companions, different as they were, looking in the same direction, toward understanding and growth. What's truly beautiful about this story, boss, is that it didn't end in some fairy tale miracle. They didn't live happily ever after. His parents still haven't changed. The nephew might pee his pants again. And Larry might still struggle the next time he has to choose between silence and speaking up. But the difference is, next time he won't be alone. And she won't feel betrayed, even if she's disappointed again. Because now they both understand something deeper. Loving each other doesn't mean always agreeing. It means learning how to move through disagreement without losing each other along the way. A small matter, yes, just a kid peeing his pants and an adult who didn't speak up. But the bigger story was about love, hurt, dignity, and the power of forgiveness. No happy couple has never argued. What makes them happy isn't that they never get it wrong, but that they're brave enough to make it right together.